All right, so as you can see, or I hope everybody can see my screen, that my talk today is called Under the Circumstances, Reflections on Engagement and Collaboration. And I'll let you in on what I mean by under the circumstances in a moment. But I think we can all relate to the ways in which certain circumstances have upended our lives, our professional lives, our work, our family life, not only due to COVID, but the sort of racial reckoning that we've all had to wrestle with this year. And so there are always circumstances that we're wrestling with, but especially in the past year, circumstances have been pervasive in complicating doing anything around collaboration and engagement in any communities. And so I want to talk a little bit about sort of the principles behind the work that we do if we do anything in the built environment that should guide, I think, collaboration and engagement. Talk a little bit about my origins that inform my approach to the work, and then really dig into the circumstances through practice stories, and then offer some of the insights that I've gleaned so far from all of these experiences. So the principles that I am referencing today are in part of AIA's equitable framework, but these are really kind of straightforward, basic, rules of thumb that I'm sure even a lot of you students have already been told, that being effective is about identifying and speaking to your stakeholders, but you have to know who they are, and that's not always straightforward. And it's important to work with communities to define what the goals are. Very often we come in with an idea as researchers or as practitioners, and we've already decided what the goal should be because we have a research question. And sometimes we're not always effective because we haven't tapped into or taken the time to figure out what the shared goal is. And how do we center, or rather it's important to center people in any planning process. We're preoccupied with the built environment. We should be. That's what we get to be preoccupied with as planning or design scholars. However, it's important to center people in all of that process. So I do want to give some context for why I'm so concerned with the role of people in engagement. And some of it is very personal and some of it is professional. The personal is on the, I guess it'd be the left-hand side of your screen. The top is the picture of my great-grandmother who's in Riceville, Texas. I used to spend time with her on her chicken farm. Where is Riceville? It's around Gester and West Belfort in Southwest Houston. Smack dab in the middle of Houston was this African-American community that I never knew as significant, but spent so much time there with my great-grandmother. And then the picture below is my grandmother standing in the middle between her two sisters in Independence Heights, another historic African-American community that was once its own town. So I had these deep roots in these historic places, but didn't know them as being significant at all. I just knew them as places where my family lived. And then on the other side of the screen, you see some of my professional work at the City of Houston, where I assisted with doing some engagement work there with the Houston Housing and Community Development Department. And so I was in charge of getting out word and collecting input around people's desires for how they wanted their funding spent, particularly community development block grant funding, and also Hurricane Ike funding. And so I got a handful. I got a real intense, in-your-face perspective on people who felt they were left out of the process, and I had to quickly devise new ways of thinking about how to do this work. And a lot of that required me honing in on how do we get to the people rather than always expecting the people to come to us. And so these experiences really inform this diagram, which is part of a publication I published recently in an anthology on preservation and social inclusion. And this diagram really exemplifies what I encountered both personally and professionally in terms of the ways cities and planners have engaged with African American communities. The sense was that historic places are in the past, and so there's a real emphasis on memorialization of a past, but not tying that into the future. An assumption we all live in inner cities, that we don't really have an aesthetic, that our aesthetic is that of decay, or we've altered someone else's landscape and it needs to be brought back up to a standard. There's always a seeking of a one-size-fits-all solution. There's a interest often on behalf of planners or universities to find the gatekeeper or the safe individual that can give us entree into the community without much consideration of whether or not that is the best voice or the most authentic voice for that community. And that everything happens in blocks and corridors. That's the way communities are set up, that's the way demographics are organized. And of course, we know differently, but we don't always operate with that consciousness. And so with that, that all informs my larger project that I've been working on since 2014, which is the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, which originated as a doctoral project. As mentioned before, it's an evolving social justice initiative, and we do three things. We record and analyze placekeeping stories about African American communities from the perspective of African American communities. We built a database of both public and private, both qualitative and quantitative and spatial data about these places in the atlas, our public-facing aspect of our work. And then all of those experiences, all of that information in the database informs participatory research that we engage in with communities. But before I talk about all that, I want to first back up and talk about this idea of circumstances and what I mean by circumstances. And so I'll talk about these practice stories that happen under certain circumstances. The first of which being one in which the communities or the stakeholders are African American, Latino, and living in an unincorporated area. The next in which we're talking about Austin and it's what I call its landscapes of demolition. Another condition is that of being a community that doesn't live in place, but is committed to place, and that is the Freedom Colony diaspora. And the last condition is that of being a place that doesn't show up in planning because it's never been on the map or it's been discreetly on the map. And as a result, not a part of planning practices. But to give you an idea more of what I'm talking about as circumstances, just to back up from Texas and the particular communities that I'm concerned with, there's a great article by April Jackson and others, Gown Goes to Town. And this article, I really like it because it has this section here that really describes circumstances that people encounter. Community planning processes that aim to engage historically Black communities need to attend to the distinct visions that these communities articulate for meeting their needs and desires. They need to recognize there's not a single African American community engagement process or spatial imaginary. Engagement processes must be sensitive to local context, and that includes spaces in which neighborhood residents organize, the different forms of knowledge and communication that are privileged in these spaces, the timelines appropriate to the circumstances and capacity of the local community, and the particular priorities and needs of that neighborhood. That is a mouthful, and it's a lot, but these are all very pertinent to engagement and collaboration with Black communities. I learned a lot of that kind of the hard way with a community called Fifth Street. And Fifth Street is one of those unincorporated communities. And unincorporated places are places that experience what's called municipal underbounding. And this classification of places are places in which annexation policies and practices in these types of municipalities, they often grow around low-income minority communities, and they're left outside the reach of city voting rights and municipal services. So they're fringe communities, they're adjacent to cities, and are influenced by city initiatives, but they're often in county territory. And counties are responsible for these spaces, but have inadequate funding and resources to support them, and often due to racism, pretty simply, and classism, the larger, more wealthier nearby municipality doesn't want to annex in this this area that needs badly needed services. And the consequences are a diluted voting power of African Americans and Latinos who live often in these areas, a lack of services. So that's clean water, sidewalks, sewage, health impacts. As a consequence of those type of conditions, there's gastrointestinal illnesses and asthma, and there's slow law enforcement and EMS services. And this all impacts not only quality of life, but also community safety. And this was especially apparent to me in Fifth Street, which is located in Fort Bend County. You'll see over here to the right, unincorporated Fort Bend County. Those dark areas, the black areas, are the unincorporated areas. They're not official towns or cities or municipalities. So Fifth Street, located in Fort Bend County and right on the border between Houston, or rather Harris County, and Fort Bend, is part of Stafford, part of Missouri City, and part of the county all at once. So they had a quality of life below area standards. How do we know that? The top half of your screen has a normal, single family home in a suburban area. That area is less than a mile from the area right below it, which is the box below, where you'll see litter and what is a large bayou or ditch, where people are dropping waste and all sorts of things. And you see standing water on the left, because they still have the ditches in front of people's homes that can hold mosquitoes and everything else. So you had these types of living conditions close to that house, to suburbia. And so this was in an unincorporated area. It became a census designated place in 1990, so it never was officially called Fifth Street as a place until then. And as I said, 3 jurisdictions who all were treating it like a hot potato. Nope, you take it, you take it, you take it. And there was entrenched political leadership that rejected annexation. Same mayor for 55 years in Stafford, in which most of Fifth Street was located, said no annexation. So the Fifth Street project was an opportunity for students, myself included, to work with this community, with residents, to say, what if you had something that really spoke to the character of who you are and your conditions, so that you could go to funders with that report, or go to progressive developers and say, this is the vision we have for our area. They're predominantly Latino, 80% Latino actually, and low income, though it had been historically a freedom colony in which some of my family members actually are buried and lived. And what we did is we did 3 things, 3 modes of engagement with 2 other students. Task force meetings. So we had to get people who lived in all of the areas, Fort Bend, Missouri City, Stafford, who were invested in some way in the future of the area. Community surveying, and we did train the trainer workshops, so people were equipped to do surveys well after the time we left, and also a charrette with the help of the brilliant ADDC. And we did a housing and business market research report. So that came together in a study based in part on the charrette, where we had the development of a community core. So while there was an old city grid here, it was really more of a place with sprawling open green space, very undefined, very rural, and very much a possibility of having a green village. And so we had a charrette with local business owners and residents, in which we looked at issues around walkability and grocery stores and housing options, just a grand kind of vision for what they wanted the community to be, and presented that to the county. So we had a participatory kind of asset-based perspective that revealed the needs, the priorities, the vision. And but the presentation revealed a lot of barriers and inequities around housing and fair housing violations that no one was doing anything about. We had county commissioners that were committed to certain residents' voices more than others. And we had developers and residents really at loggerheads, because developers wanted a way to come in and purchase land easily and aggregate it. But we had a proliferation of air property and title issues. and a lot of developers, frankly, who wanted to come in as vultures and just do what they wanted to, and thought this report was going to help them do that, frankly, and were disappointed. The result was that there is one small middle income development that was built, a multifamily development. I found out about a year ago, they started building. And what I did learn from this, however, is that these circumstances demand political change. You can have a report, you can have a book, you can have a process. But until you have different political leadership wanting to really think about annexation, it's going to be difficult to make substantive change. So the political conditions were important and remain important in that situation. I also had the opportunity while at UT, in addition to doing that project in partnership with the Center for Sustainable Development, I was given the opportunity as a fellow to teach a course. And I focused it on my experiences or the circumstances of Austin's cultural and economic landscape, which is one in many ways of building and building and building, but it is really a landscape in many ways of demolition. And I came to understand that circumstance as an Austin Historic Landmark Commissioner. As you see here in this particular article, it's showing that the Austin's Historic Landmark Commission approved 35 demolitions with no discussion. Thankfully, that was after I left. But while I was there were so many demolitions coming before us, so many issuance of permits, and we didn't have people who were often equipped to say, our house is historically significant, our property is historically significant. The neighborhood wasn't coming forth to say that. They didn't know how to say that or how to prove that up. And as a result, we would say, oh, well, no one here wants to move for historic zoning, or myself and Terry Myers there, and maybe a few others would say, let's move for historic zoning. We couldn't get the votes. And over, you had a demolition of these homes, which led to the dissipation of the settlement patterns that define some of these culturally significant communities. And so between 2008 and 2016, you could see here from this chart, all of the concentration of the demolitions and in what areas. And this is not what we were here for. We were to protect historic resources and to encourage people to create historic districts and to protect properties. But that was far from what we were doing. Here's the only thing we could do. We could ask them, or rather the staff, the Historic Preservation Office would say, you must submit a documentation package before we tear your property down, before we tear this property down. And what that would entail is all the information about the history of the house, and then that would be filed at the Austin History Center. So I also, at the same time that I was involved in that, was involved in the Austin Historical Survey Wiki as a research assistant, where I learned so much about deploying technology to document historic resources. But I also learned, as noted in this article with Jenny Minner and Dr. Holleran, in A Smart City Remembers Its Past, that among residents of color, they wanted to figure out ways to control the images, planning, and funding related to their cultural assets. And they were really interested in telling stories about the lost places and weren't always most interested in documenting architectural elements. Now, this doesn't mean that Black folks don't care about preservation of buildings. What it means is that when we say words like history and preservation, embedded in the meaning of those words for communities of color are a variety of ideas, including talking about what's lost and doesn't remain anymore, as well as buildings, as well as all the things in the landscape that contributed to sense of place. And so I began to get curious about how we capture that kind of information. So when I had an opportunity to teach a class, I wanted to know, how do you teach future planners and preservationists to center the people and their stories? Because essentially what we were learning from the Austin Historical Wiki surveying experience is that a lot of people wanted to tell the stories and center the people in the communities and the neighborhoods. So how could we do that to argue for a different dimension of significance, which is already on the books? You can have community significance, which is part of the local ordinance on historic preservation in the city of Austin. Nobody really argues to put something on the make it a historic landscape on that basis. But what if we did? Is sort of what I asked with this class. So I gave them, the students, a list of those packets, that is addresses of places that we had moved or that we had released permits for, and those packages were at the Austin History Center, to say, should that demolition have occurred? And what are the signifiers in the landscape of this culture of demolition that sort of undermines the existence of these places or the preservation of these places? Not to say that there had been some miscarriage of justice. Okay, so when I say should the demolition have occurred, it wasn't bringing a legal case. It was saying, if we had more tools and more options for how to communicate significance, might we have made a difference in arguing against demolition? And so the data source that we used was the Austin Landmark Commission documentation packets of these specific buildings. So I took the students there to learn a quick building history. I taught them how to use social media and digital humanities tools to do small scale kind of archival and ethnographic research, and to create these arguments or final papers that creatively applied preservation regulations and critical theories of place. And just one of the examples that we had was this wonderful story, this digital project that Annie Stockelman did about Ridgetop Elementary School, which is gone. And it was really an interesting, and excuse the inappropriate terms, but this is from 1975, that this was Austin's Trainable Mentally Retarded Facility was the name at that time. Ridgetop Elementary had an interesting, significant history in promoting the protection of disability rights. And all of that has been erased with the demolition of Ridgetop, or the proposed closure, at least, of Ridgetop. And so what she did is tried to collect these stories about Ridgetop. So this is one example as a model for if a community is facing the prospect of destruction of a place, what can you do about it? And then my own research was about how you look at story as a method for identifying or aggregating stakeholder voices, and also being able to give them a place in the public square. So again, freedom colonies are historic African-American settlements, primarily in coastal or in bottomland. They were primarily rural. With the growth of Texas, they're in every, what we call transect, right? Rural, urban, exurban. Founded based on intentionality and agencies anchored by churches, schools, and cemeteries, and often by the collective belief of place existed. If there's so many of these places, and at one time there were over 550 of them, what happened to them? We had the Great Migration, violence, led to population loss, infrastructure projects bifurcated these communities. You had a building integrity, demolition by neglect, zoning, and deferred maintenance, all cumulatively left us often with nothing but intangible heritage to understand the significance of these places. And they're pretty, as I mentioned before, demolitions, but this map is showing you two things. In regard to the three threats to freedom colony survival: vulnerability, access, and visibility. The vulnerability is manifested in this map because the dark green areas are showing you the concentration of freedom colonies that are places where there's a concentration of freedom colonies, and the hash marks over the next layer is showing you where it was inundated or designated a disaster area after Hurricane Harvey. So you see a lot of those red stripes or hash marks across areas where there's concentration of freedom colonies. So you see this kind of ecological vulnerability. You also see in the middle here, in Independence Heights, they have a Whole Foods. However, we see that the people that come into the neighborhood that have moved there are also driving up taxes and also displacing people in that community. as a consequence. And then you have at the top sort of the invisibility of these communities, the consequences of which is when there are infrastructure or strategic and capital planning happening, these places are invisible or ignored. Sand Branch, Texas, this community outside of Dallas, still has problems with running water. And so I took an asset-based approach in my own research when I learned about a community called Schenkelville, which was using its culture in the form of a festival to draw people back to the community, which is 5 hours from you in Austin. And it's on the border, about 50 miles from the border with Louisiana, in a place called Newton County. And so you'll see on the map the shaded areas, Jasper and Newton counties. And those are two counties that are more well known for hate crimes and as being unfriendly to African Americans than they are known for being spaces of African American freedom of agency. But that's what I found. This is the community core of Schenkelville. You don't see any blocks, you don't see any corridors. You see a road. That road leads you to a small house, a homestead on the National Register of Historic Places. You see a historical marker here. Schenkelville is one of the more prominent freedom colonies in this area. They do have signage. They do have this annual event that they hold. But to get to most of the communities here, you're either going to go down a dirt road like that on the bottom. You're going to follow behind a lot of the timber industry that's decimating the forest there, or you're going to cross over bridges of reservoirs that many of which were developed or built, these man-made lakes, well before the National Historic Preservation Act. So you have the inundation of whole communities to make these new recreation areas as a consequence. But in the midst of all of that, Schenkelville had held onto its origin story, which is that of two enslaved Africans in Mississippi, one of which was sold away to a master in Texas, and that was Winnie Schenkel. Jim Schenkel followed after her, and they found each other again at the spring here in Schenkelville, which is a place of ritual, of remembrance, and it's a touchstone for a remembrance of the tenacity and the determination for the founders of this community to pursue and achieve some semblance of freedom and autonomy by building this community near this very spring. And so they return every year to annual events. So they have all these traditions where they commemorate Schenkelville. And you'll note here in these pictures, people come from everywhere and are committed to this annual homecoming where they share the story and commemorate the founders. But what you should also notice here at the table are individuals from freedom colonies all over. They are from all over the two-county area. And you see intergenerational exchange and commemoration. And there's involvement in real, as we say, real rehabilitation and real preservation work, where people come back here to rehabilitate that homestead, which belonged to the descendants of the founders. So I observed this cycle of foundational stories that fostered place attachment, that encouraged participation, that catalyzed real planning outcomes. And I thought to myself, is this just about Schenkelville, or is this something that's happening everywhere? And I asked a bunch of questions. I started asking everyone who is associated with freedom colonies in the area these questions. And I started with Schenkelville, wanting to know about their events, their traditions, their origin story, the residency status, full-time, part-time, variety of questions about the status of these communities and those who are trying to keep them alive. And that culminated in an opportunity to partner with the community of Schenkelville on their annual Freedom Colony Symposium in 2015, where we asked those questions or posed them to freedom colonies from all over the state who wanted to come out to the festival and share their story. And we had individuals who came from Texas Historical Commission, which I'm very grateful. So it wasn't just about, hi, I'm going to come here and share my story, but I'm going to share my story as a freedom colony descendant, tell you what I'm doing to save my own community, what's working, what's not working, and what I need. in the presence of leadership from Texas Historical Commission and from the Summerlee Foundation, so that there was a bringing together or a hybrid approach to telling these stories and exposing what's happening on the ground. So what I learned from this is to ID local practices, you engage in a sort of sampling. What's working? Everything I noticed was happening in churches. So how could I sample that? And, you know, this is partly from an article I wrote, Remixing as Practice, Arnstein's Ladder Through the Grassroots Preservationist Lens, in which we talk about metaphorically, much like rap sampling, how is it that you loop and reenact these samples of local culture in a way that doesn't appropriate, but also recognizing the value and the richness of the local knowledge in the area in planning these events in which you're performing research and also performing service. And so the testimony service opened doors to more settlements through snowball sampling. And we yielded this long agenda. This is sort of a laundry list of all the things, one of which was, how do we get a centralized location for all this information? They wanted, okay, you're asking all these stories. Well, we want this access to this information too, about what's going on in these places. What do they need? What, you know, where can we find more information? Where can we connect with one another? And so in the process of doing all this, not only did I learn what they need, I learned where they are. So I started out thinking that there were about 14 settlements, and they were all called Freedom Colonies in Thitten and Conrad's book. And what I found, actually, in Sitten in Conrad's book, I found that there were many more settlements, and that some of them they referred to Black pockets of certain areas or neighborhoods, and not just Freedom Colonies or Black settlements. So there was a counter map of this area with a very large African-American footprint, which got me to thinking, why don't we make an atlas? So this was something, and I know my committee is here laughing about a paragraph in the back of the dissertation that really grew into, with the help of master's students at Texas A&M, something we call the Texas Freedom Colonies Atlas, where we go out into communities, or we were going out into communities, and here we are in Brenham, where we ask people to geotag and aggregate and we secure and centralize all kinds of data, because that's what I did while I was doing my dissertation work. And how do we shift from, we use this to shift from just an architecture property lens to more of a survey focus of information about place, in a way to address the visibility of these places, in a way to spatialize the intangible and the vulnerabilities, and to increase descendants' access to all of this information for their own. So to look at basically what this all is, it's a lot of data. It's census designated places. You know, we wanted to start with as much publicly available data. So we have layers of the data you see here from Texas Historical Commission, the National Register of Historic Places, USGS, that's already in the atlas. But then we invited through survey people to upload things like funeral programs and other ephemera, and we ended up with those dots you see on the map, both crowdsourced data through the surveys, which then produced a dot on the map, and this resulted in us being able to map 357, and we've crowdsourced 82 entries so far. This is what the atlas looks like. The Atlas version 2.0 tab takes you in to look at this. The Tell Your Story and the Black Settlement Surveys are the ways in which you can add information directly to the atlas. And we have a guidebook to help you in understanding how to do that. And you can add buildings and structures as well. And this is just examples of the types of things people upload. And they tell us long stories. They say, I don't know much. And then they commence to give us the origin stories and the names of all these places. It's really incredible, the volume of information that people are producing for us in the form of these surveys. So what might I have learned from some of this when it comes to ongoing engagement and scholarship and collaboration? And this is under any circumstances. Leverage and value local knowledge. The way that people define the place, the way that people are defining the issues, and the way that people are defining themselves as stakeholders is not going to be the way in which you might think about it, the ways that we are traditionally trained to think about it. Now, we have in our APA planning ethics is that you are to serve the public interest. Serving the public interest requires you know who the stakeholders are. So this is really at the core of doing your job effectively as a planner, is knowing who is the stakeholder. And that doesn't always mean a owner of property full-time in a community. I'm going to show you a number of ways, some applications of how to modify some of the methods I've already been using, so you can see that you have to modify methods in relationship to context and embrace cultural humility and adjust your research agenda and your design accordingly. And I'll talk specifically about what that looks like too. So local knowledge comes in two forms as I've encountered it. In the first picture, the woman in the bright green suit, Mrs. Palmer, the late Mrs. Palmer. The hard thing in doing this work is in the short time I've done this, so many people have passed away, which is why it's so urgent. And Mrs. Palmer there stood up and had on paper in the middle of her homecoming at Pleasant Hill, this bunch of paper with typed word, just kind of ruffled up and didn't look like much. And then she commenced to tell the whole story of the community for the last 85 years. Church historians are the people who hold so much knowledge about community and place and what holds place together. And she was one of those people. And I wouldn't have learned much about not only her community, but the region without Mrs. Palmer. And she's really, in that Homestead article, won an award for it. She is the star, one of the stars of that article. The other star of the article is in the middle there in the red shirt, and that's Harold Odom. And he has his cousins there with him who have helped rehabilitate this house. But the local knowledge here is that the builder of the house was a local carpenter and a flue flasher. He was a builder, and he built all of this by hand. And so we would have these wonderful discussions about the reverse engineering of that porch behind him and what it took, a combination of pictures and learning how he had repurposed certain types of woods and materials from other buildings from around the region, and how some they could find and some they couldn't find anymore. So there was a lot of local knowledge that informed the building practices here that helped them to rehabilitate this so it could remain on the National Register of Historic Places, and they could become eligible for more funding to keep this building viable. So I talk a lot about storytelling, and there's different types of storytelling, and storytelling is shorthand for oral traditions of various kinds, right? So when we're talking about storytelling in the context of doing it in African-American communities, it really has a powerful way of disrupting, interrupting public history creation in other contexts. So I was invited out to Gonzales a couple of years ago, and it's a very interesting place with a lot of Texas history, primarily Texas history, the whole come and get it, canon is here in Gonzales. But there's a deep African-American history that wasn't brought to the fore. And so I had their local historic commission call me and say, you know what, we know we haven't done the greatest job. All of our leadership is older and white, and we don't really know what to do about it. We want to do some survey projects, but we also want to change the makeup of our county historical commission. And this certified local government program at Texas Historical Commission got that request and said, let's get Dr. Roberts to come out, talk about her surveying and outreach practices. And I said, well, let me do some assessment too. Let's guide them through some self-assessment exercises. One of which was having people come up and tell their core story about Gonzales. So an African-American woman would tell her core story as a family and as a community, and her experiences of where she enjoyed going, where she didn't feel safe going, And white individuals would do the same, and Native American people would do the same. And so in hearing each other's core stories of the same place, everyone was confronted with a cacophony of contrast and life experience and what the public history truly is. And they also did these self-assessment exercises about what they had been doing to try to recruit diverse leadership and what they could be doing differently. And so that has turned into a few stories and hopefully, fingers crossed, a larger study of county historical commissions in the state and their efforts and how to diversify or lack thereof, and the tools they could be using to draw people together to rethink public history creation as a way to reinvigorating county historical commissions. And I'll end with cultural humility. Elizabeth Sweet, who is kind of a shero of mine, Dr. Elizabeth Sweet, wrote this incredible essay, Cultural Humility, an Open Door for Planners to Locate Themselves in Decolonized Planning Theory, Education, and Practice. Highly recommended article, where she talks about the sort of God's eye view that many planners have of themselves. And it's an idea that the way we see things is the only way to see things, or we have the established correct way to think about, or the normative view of what places should be all about. And part of this requires that we go in instead with a posture of humility. And that means going where you're invited, acting with a service spirit, expecting complications, but also assuming competence among those you're working with, and holding the space for what I might call a spirit of dispossession. And I say spirit because you can use that word spirit, you could say instead, things that are invisible or intangible, but that you know exist. Feelings. And feelings matter in planning processes because they inform perception, and perception informs what people are going to do and not going to do with you. And also trauma of past experiences with other people. So these are all dimensions of understanding having a sort of cultural humility. So I can tell you, I've had to have cultural humility. So people often say to me, oh, you're Black, you go into Black communities, so you don't have to do this work. I do a lot of this work. I do it every day. And we had a community partners meeting. My neighborhood revitalization class met with over 20 to 25 folks from Freedom Colonies. We brought them up to Texas A&M to have lunch. And then we talked to them about what they saw as the future for the Atlas, okay? So we said, critique the Atlas. All right, what's going on? What do you think about it? And so we had lovely women like these women who were age, 65 to 85. And so let me look at your computer, baby. What's on? What is this? And they wanted some different things. They wanted us to account more for the digital divide. Okay, can you provide paper surveys? Could you, do some different types of outreach? Create more space for us to network and share resources. We need better ease of use, more local training. So they had all these things they wanted, right? And that really informs some of the things we're doing now. One of the things that we're doing is we added a layer of information about transportation projects. So rather than just saying, here's the Atlas, and it's really important, we've begun adding more information and creating guidebooks on how to use it. So a week from today, we'll have a guidebook on how to read a layer we've added about coming transportation projects in close proximity to Freedom Colonies that are underway or will be underway in the next 10 years, and information on how to provide input as a stakeholder. Texas Department of Transportation has really intelligent, brilliant staff that gave us this information. And the reason why we think we have a value added in providing it and facilitating this is that there's people who don't live there full time, that aren't going to get the mailings and the notices necessarily about what's happening in their Freedom Colony, but they may want to speak up. And so that's one thing that we're doing in terms of modifying storytelling methods and information and all of that. We've developed a Freedom Colony guide. So these students here are taking a tour of a Freedom Colony, a Hopewell Freedom Colony, and they develop guidebooks during the Texas Cultural Landscape Symposium for use during that, so that people have tools for understanding their environment. And finally, the new media aspect of what we're doing during COVID is Coffee Talk. We just had one this morning where we introduced this, which is our Adopt a County campaign. And Adopt a County simply means that we're developing teams of community members to work online together to build community around finishing counties. That is, we have list of counties, we have missing data. How can you come and help us as communities? And how can we train you to use different types of information to find the remaining data for the data points we have on the map? So we may have a place, but we don't have the story, or we have the story, but we don't have the location. And so this is a new campaign we're launching where we ask and invite you today to choose a county, join our virtual community, choose a Freedom Colony, identify the needed information, and let the search begin. Right now we're recruiting and educating, and we'll hold orientations in November. If you have a phone, and if you have a camera on your phone and you point it at the screen right now, theoretically, and not so theoretically, you can scan that QR code on the screen and it'll give you a survey to sign up. Let's say you don't do that right now and you're not that tech savvy or don't have your phone. Email us, and you will be able to get an opportunity to sign up. And we're giving everybody who signs up a little booklet that I mentioned before, that guidebook on how to find a Freedom Colony, and we'll send that out to you. And with that, I'd like to hand it back over to Dr. Oden. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic talk. Thanks so much, Andrea. It's really great. So why don't we open it up to questions? I think Catherine has a question, Catherine Perez. We'll try to get, it's hard to say who's first. Catherine. Catherine.
Hi, I don't have a question. That was just an applause.
Oh, that was, yeah, okay. I got the emoji wrong.
Thank you though, it was great.
Folks have questions?
I have one. Hi, Andrea.
Hi.
Thank you so much. I'm also a big fan of your work, and I'm so glad that you joined us today. I'm wondering about the generations and how I loved how you talked about adapting your community and stakeholder engagement strategies to who the stakeholders are. And as part of that, I think a lot about young people and how we fold them into these initiatives. And so you mentioned that a lot of your work involves elders in communities. And so can you say a little bit about differences in generations and how you're working with those differences or even similarities if you find that to be a saving point?
Yeah, it's interesting. It started out being elders, and I would say silent generation to the greatest generation, you know, if we're going to talk those kind of categories, when I was on the ground. And now that we're in COVID, we're primarily talking with people who are more so baby boomers. So we've got these baby boomers who are really the last link between those extreme elders in place and the rest of us. They're the link in the chain that have some computer savvy and often a lot of computer savvy. And we're really tapping into them because they're interested and they have the ability to aggregate knowledge and they want to learn new things. And some of them have a little time on their hands. Then the next generation is sort of my generation that's sort of looking at this and saying, what does this have to do with, you know, whether people eat or not, and Black Lives Matter and police brutality and everything else. And so there's this challenge of relevance and communicating the relevance and tying it into existing efforts to just learn to archive what's happening right now and, you know, skill building. So then it's like, what do we offer in the way of skill building that helps people who are doing movement work, period? So we're trying to, for example, with the Adopt a County say, all right, you come and help us with this, But in the process, we're going to tell you about data sources. We're going to tell you about how to secure and safeguard data. We're going to talk about data ethics, how to keep it safe, you know, how to make sure not everybody in the world knows everybody's personal business, because some of it's new, right? Or some of it's rather, it's modern, it's people are living and have that data. And then there's millennials, Generation Z, Y, all of those people. I can't keep up. And but everybody below 35. And we have on my team, I've been really privileged to have 2 young people who are like, hey, archives are cool. You know, they make t-shirts. One is called the Millennial Archivist. And so I allow them to use their language and their ways of speaking and new media to kind of bring in people. So they're like, I want to do coffee talk. I want to do podcasts. I want to do a show. And I was like, okay, but the data, and we need to collect. Yeah, okay, but people don't care. And the young people are not going to, I'm like, okay, well, we'll do a show then. You know, so we've had to do some things to draw people that in, and also allow people on the team to kind of, Skylar Carter, who does the Millennial Archivist, and Cemetery Sister, which is my other student, Jennifer Blanks. They have their own kind of identities, right? And so they see Texas Freedom Colonies Project. I say, look, this is not marketing. This is relationship. This is, you know, my commitment to Freedom Colonies. That's why it's called Freedom Colonies Project. And they're like, yeah, but this is the way I want to do it and the way I want to put myself out in the world and my research. So I think it's flexibility is the short answer of, you know, saying that there's different ways of communicating to different audiences. And it's not just for me to do that communicating. I have to grow other people, young people who want to do this work in the way they want to do it. I hope that answered your question, Miriam.
Other questions?
I think Dean Addington had a question.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I see. Yeah, you got your hand up.
Thank you so much for coming. This was really terrific, and it was also really timely given the fact that we had Ted Gordon and Tara Dudley speaking on Monday night, and then my question is actually going to build on that. And bear with me while I try to formulate this question. But it comes down to sort of the question of the role of archives. Tara focused on the use of archives to actually deal with provenance, you know, and tracing the provenance of a building and of a site. And then Ted actually was using archives to follow a family, you know, and as that family was progressively moved, dislocated, and displaced throughout there. And it was sort of really rich to see that the two different narratives that could grow from the archives. And what I was thinking about as you were talking is that we might, and this is where my question is going to come in, we might consider that type of archival material, that type of archival material to be, let's just say, objective, and the stories that you're bringing to play in the atlas, you know, fill in the lived experience of it. You know, it takes the framework that one might have from the archives and sort of like makes it live from that. But I was also sort of reflecting on one of the slides you had where you talked about how, you know, in your interviews and your discussions, that architectural details were the things that were not sort of like foregrounded in certainly the lived experience of that. And it takes me back to what happened in Society Hill in Philadelphia with that urban renewal project, and how they were able to construct the rationale, much of the rationale for that, you know, that massive project and the significant displacement that took place on the architectural detail that they had gleaned from fire insurance archives. And they were using the archives in some ways as a cover, some ways as a proxy for what they really wanted to do by making those historic archives of architectural details to be the neutral ground when they were anything but neutral. And so you start to see in things like that what we might think of as objective information from the archives actually can be subjectively applied. And you begin to wonder, if you start thinking about these different lived experiences and these different experiences and narratives, whether there's actually more objective within that in terms of what the circumstances are at a given time. So I have more just questions as opposed to a question on that, in terms of how do you work those different modes of information, data, value, because that all comes into play in that, together into something that would be coherently used in order to guide how you move in the future. That's a life question as opposed to a question one can answer in something like this. But I was really sort of struck by this sort of triumvirate or this tripartite nature of how these different things would weave together.
Yeah, and this makes me really point to a lot of the things that I learned from Ted Gordon, for example, who I really root my diaspora framework in his work. I was his student. And so it was interesting for you to mention him, because a lot of my looking at this internal diaspora is from him. And Dr. Dudley is, of course, great friend, colleague, and she's actually a part of Texas Freedom Colonies project in that her class is doing some of this archival work. And I will say that there is the big contestation here in the Texas Freedom Colonies project is the notion of the archive. We are building an archive. There is the assumption that there is the archive and that everything is just everything else, right? And so one of the things I learned from working on the Austin Historical Wiki is that studying the process is important. So it's not just, we'll get all the information and the goal is the information, but we're learning from the process a lot of things. And with the Wiki process, we were very much looking at participation and the nature of what people thought during participation. And we're doing that with the Texas Freedom Colonies project as we have students who are working with this data. So the research methodology is real classic qualitative, triangulation. So in certain ways, it's kind of at the core of anyone doing qualitative social science work. But it's also historical archival work in that you're trying to triangulate, what people establish as the correct real information, the Sanford, the Sanford, fire maps, the census data, right? So that's all in our map. We're like, look, we're putting that all there. But the stories are filling in a gap of sorts, but the way that people interpret the word story is something to be studied too, in that people interpret the word story very often as, let me wind you a tale, a memory about what it was like to walk around and feel safe as a Black woman in the middle of the country in 1970. This is what I ate. This is what we picked. This is the joy I felt. And then the other is the example I showed you where someone is giving me the date the church was founded. That's the last church there. The dates that people still show up and worship there. The names of the pastors, family names. So the depth of information you get when you say the word, give me a story, is a finding that, that I hope to be able to report more on, which I think can help answer your question. Because telling people, give me your story, is loaded. If you say, okay, I need the history, sometimes that turns into a bunch of people saying, you know what, she doesn't want what I have because it's not legitimate because she said history. And some people determine that that's the archive and they don't give you any information. So you're already shutting down. There's an editing and prohibition you've already put into the process. Whereas when you say story, and data and information, we get a flood of everything. We get a flood of some of the things that you would put in the category of what proves up provenance. We get pictures of buildings. We get pictures of people in the middle of building things. We get people gathering for events. We get small business people. You know, we get so many things. I can't even begin. But we're learning a lot from the process about what people think story and archive are. And what we're learning is that by using these different words, you either get things or you don't get things from the public. And we're losing a lot, I think, because of our languaging to some extent, where we say, those are the experts over there, and I get to put my stuff in there if they think it's okay, versus I'm going to give you my stuff and I'm going to look at it as a researcher and go, oh, maybe I'm not using the right parameters or thinking about this correctly. And, you know, that's grounded theory. That's, again, the qualitative research world I live in. And these are, you know, tools that everybody uses, but it's an iterative learning process as well, in terms of how to approach this and how to outreach in ways that matter. In terms of the information being used against people and used against communities, the sort of official archive, that made me also think of a piece that I wrote a time back about Georgetown and how that was an African-American enclave. And ironically, you know, we know during the New Deal, with the influx of growing government and all of those employees needing a place to live, they all were like, I'm going to Georgetown. And then they decided, oh, this is blighted because you have all these historic buildings and they're not being used in the, or not, you know, being sustained up to their period of significance, and their integrity is gone, is the kind of conversations that we have now, right? And so these are often barriers and create what I call a preservation apartheid, which says this is legitimate and this is not legitimate. And so those are kind of some of the arguments that we're trying to bring to the fore in this whole archive piece of even questioning, you know, what's legitimate and what we're missing as researchers when we don't offer parameters that are truly inclusive and open. I hope that got at some of what you were curious about.
Next question.
Hi, thank you for sharing. I was wondering if you feel that striving for community preservation and promoting sustainable communities that increase quality of life and access for future generations are opposing strategies, and how do we try to balance those two without leaving people behind or losing community history?
Can you ask me that one more time?
I was wondering if you feel that striving for community preservation and promoting sustainable communities that increase quality of life or access, you know, for future generations are opposing strategies, and how do we balance those without leaving people behind or losing community history?
Oh, they can be. I'll give you an example from my class, what I learned from a student. One of my students, when I was teaching the what's that, cultural landscapes and ethnographic methods was the name of the course that I taught while I was a lecturer at UT as a postdoc. And one of my students did a piece on Blackland community, and that was, we know so much about the changes in Blackland, but she really went around and documented the signifiers of the landscape of demolition. And those signifiers are the evidence of the loss, or the evidence of this cultural landscape of demolition was all the markers of what we'd say is, wow, look at those really wonderful green buildings. look at, we suddenly have sidewalks and we didn't have before. Oh, look at these bike lanes. So the people who already lived there probably would have liked a lot of those things, but a lot of those, oh gosh, we use the wrong word, I think, when we say, you know, a lot of these benefits of having a sustainable community and green space and all of those things are things that we should have and make available and not wait until all the people who originally live in the community leave, right? And so it's not a definite, green gentrification doesn't always have to happen. I would look to the work of someone like Kofi Boone, who's been writing really, really well and doing projects in which he looks straight ahead at how do we engage in design processes, for example, in a way that engages people who live in the community around preservation, flood mitigation, and engage youth at the same time. So he's been doing that in Princeville, North Carolina, where they've been dealing with, flooding and a lack of drainage and all those sorts of things. We're trying to partner right now with Tamina. They have historic cemeteries. Smack dab in the middle of the woodlands is a Black community called Tamina. And their living conditions are horrible. And their historic cemetery is underwater. So here we have Ian McHarg's, crown jewel, sustainability, model city with rich people with drainage and poor Black people with their loved ones underwater. Doesn't have to be that way. But I think that we have to find more opportunities to meet people where they are and what they need in communities and ask them what they need. And we'll get at that nexus of heritage, as you say, community preservation and sustainability. That nexus is there. In so much of what we do, it's there. Our concern about the spring in Deep East Texas is not just a sentimental, that spring is really cool and it's a symbol of, maroon communities and fugitive communities and all that. Yeah, that's really cool and it keeps people coming back. But there's also springs in the area that a lot of companies are just extracting all the water from and destroying these springs. And they don't run this, they don't, gurgle and run the same as a result. And we have hydrology issues. So at the same time that we're talking about the preservation of the natural landscape and stewardship of the land, we're also talking about dispossession of the land by corporations and people who engage in extraction. So these don't all live in silos is my point. And I think the kind of conversations we need to be having with communities is we may come in and say, we're here because we need to do an archiving project with your church. But we also need to accommodate or bring people with us that can ask allied conversations about, well, where are you putting all your historical data? Is it secure in the case of a disaster? And that may get into a whole new conversation about how they wish they had less flooding, or they do want to store their information somewhere. It's about being willing to listen and open to the fact that different issues, you may ask about one and it bleeds into another area. And you can't be everything to everybody, but you do have to be equipped to say, I know other people. I know people in our design, in landscape architecture, who'd love to talk to you about land stewardship, a cemetery stewardship, and bringing back the original plant life, right? At the same time that we just want to stop people from spray painting, right? And we want to feel safe. So there's ways to bring all of these questions together.
Next question.
I'm surprised I haven't had any critiques.
Critiques.
Yeah, I'm nervous about that.
Well, if nobody's going to jump in, I have a question, Andrea. So I guess I thought it was really compelling that you had brought this kind of text dot road planning framework into your project. And I just, and maybe I'm too cynical about text dot, but I just wonder if you've kind of thought about, or if you see this as part of your, sort of work in the project to really, I'm just thinking who makes decisions in text dot, at least sort of on the
Mhm.
ground. It's the engineers. It's the TxDOT engineer for the area. How could you get a TxDOT engineer, and how could you get the people in communities that may be threatened and or uncomfortable with a particular road plan? Have you thought about sort of educating and advocating to the kind of routine bureaucratic decision makers in TxDOT?
So here's my approach in terms of, I'll just go with the cynical part first, is that if I'm TxDOT, I am sick of having to do a project and then I have an onslaught of newspaper people coming at me later. And what if I could be kind of passively proactive and have other groups know well ahead of time that something has happened, number one. So it's sort of somewhat in their interest. I mean, they'd rather not hear anything I know because TxDOT. And I'm not talking about the wonderful employees, many of which who are friends of mine there. So let me just clarify. But there's the general bill interest in the state of Texas, both political and economic. We know that. But really, where you're coming at it in terms of talking to engineers, I'm more so thinking about the legal processes that we have available to us in historic preservation and cultural resource management. Section 106, Section 4F, Section 101, all of these aspects of the National Historic Preservation Act, as well as transportation federal law, any federally funded projects that are under, if there's any federally funded undertakings, then there must be consultation with interested parties, is what the regulations say. And so who are the interested parties and how do they figure out stuff is going on? And my calculation is that TxDOT doesn't answer those two questions very well and follow through on making sure they know the answer to those questions. They don't know, or they don't have a mechanism really for people who are not full-time residents who live elsewhere but are still stakeholders in some way, shape, or form. Like my grandmother's buried there, so I care. TxDOT doesn't know that, but I'm a stakeholder. I'm an interested party, and you should be required to consult with me. Nothing in the law says that that's not true. All the law said that is true. My thinking in testing out this initial step is how do we create an online mechanism to increase the preponderance of that activity of contact and consultation well in advance. So if we have projects that are 10 years out, then you may have engineering, beginning of engineering plans and beginning of engagement, but you're not already project underway. It is a little hard, you're right. It's like, how is someone going to come and be there for the project? But I talk to people on the ground in Jasper County, and the way they would work with projects that they were concerned about is there was going to be some toxic dump put near their settlement. And 2 people live there full-time, 20 people were there just part-time. They call those people, they came to a community meeting, they told them in the community meeting they had to take off work, they were able to take off work. And so then you had 20 people who were stakeholders showing up for a community meeting that they originally didn't expect anybody to show up for. And so this is maybe not getting at the, okay, here's a project underway right now, what can we do? But to me, it's about how do we enable people to be less on the defense and like, okay, it's time to protest project 151, one by one by one by one. I'm impatient. And so I'm always thinking, how do we think about ways that we can put a little more power in the hands of the people who live in these places by giving them a little bit of an offense positionality. And I think it's going to take a whole lot more work than my little guidebook and my little one layer. And it'll take more students, it'll take more, it's a separate whole research project and all of that. But this is, step one, and just saying, will anybody look at these layers? Will anybody take it and use it to say, hey, I see this is happening and I don't like it and I'm going to do something. So that's where we are with it right now. But the conversation you're talking about between a resident and the engineers explaining the project and why we're paving the street and, you know, making the argument for it and creating a level playing field for them to understand each other is a very interesting, worthwhile project that I don't know that I'm ready for, but that we definitely will have to address.
Other questions? We got time for one or two more. Don't be shy, it's Zoom. Brittany, did you see any questions on the sort of stream?
Nothing yet, but I do want to point out that the QR code in your presentation does work, which was very exciting.
Yes.
So if anyone, you know, revisits the recording and wants to use the QR code.
Good. We did test it this morning when we had a little, one of our coffee talk shows, which is on our YouTube channel. On our YouTube channel, we have our coffee talks. This was our 5th one. So we have 5 shows with different topics each time. We try to have a Freedom Colony descendant on, or we talk about progress on our research projects. We also have directions on how to use the Atlas. If you're running into problems, we have demonstrations. And we have, hopefully, we'll have our recording there about Adopt a County, so you can learn more about that there. But yes, we tested the QR code this morning too, so I'm glad it still works. And that's one of my, Miriam mentioned earlier about generations and young people. I said, not everybody's gonna mess with that QR code. I don't know about that. And she's like, just use your phone. And I was like, I don't know. And, you know, I use it sometimes, you know, but I said, look, you still got to have the mailing address, and we got to mail, people got to have an option to mail in. And she's like, just put your phone up. So, you know, you try to be open, try to embrace all the things, as the young people say.
Have to bridge the digital divide.
Exactly, all the divides.
But I believe we have a question from Rich Heyman.
Rich, go ahead.
Hi, Andrea. How's it going? It's good to see you.
How's it going?
All right.
Good to see you.
Thanks for your talk. It was, you know, I've been a longtime fan of the project, so it's great to hear you back here at UT. You know, as others have said, it's a great to hear your talk in the same week that we heard from Ted and Tara, you know, because there's so much interesting overlap. One of the things that they was sort of a kind of underlying framework of what they were talking about was how their work was intended to kind of disrupt dominant narratives and histories of Austin. And so I was wondering, like, how has your work on the Freedom Colonies, you know, how does that change the story of Texas? Or, you know, how do we understand what you've been documenting in terms of what that means for the way in which we, you know, understand the development of the state as a whole, and the role of these Freedom Colonies, and you know, especially of course in light of a lot of discourse today around historic you know, violence and destruction of a lot of African-American thriving communities. You know, we hear a lot about the Tulsa incident and things like that. So I just was wondering what you kind of, how your project makes us rethink history rather than planning the future.
Yeah, I get real basic with my students in planning history and theory, and I talk to them a lot about the 5 C's of history. And one of which is, you know, there's contingency and complexity, and I really try to get them to live in those a lot. That, yes, public history is exclusionary, and it's written by the victors, and, you know, heritage is the history that only certain people, you know, chosen, right? All of those things are true. But it's also, I think, about the complexity and contingency. What was made possible by this? And what was, what happened because of this, or what was contingent on this, and also what are all the factors that contribute to making this place what it is. And so I think Freedom Colonies have challenged that in a few different ways. One, the idea that African Americans all left the country and then ran to the cities, and that's how it all happened. Or they were sharecroppers and then they ran to the cities, and there's nothing in between. So it complicates that kind of understanding of what the process was. The second thing it does is it also complicates the story of places that we associate with racial violence only. So it doesn't say, oh no, that racial violence wasn't so bad, look at all the good stuff. It says racial violence was horrid, and in resistance, these people persisted in place. And so it really looks at preservation, or my work is looking at preservation as a social justice, as a form of resistance, of deciding to persist in place, whether it be through virtual or just some kind of preservation. That the archive building is all about interrupting the idea that they're gone and that it's all about the past. And it also tries to contest and complicate who gets to have their history as part of the public archive, even within the African American community. I just put a piece out on Medium last night to give you kind of the philosophy behind what we're doing and trying to challenge the notion of the Black archive as a space where we put all the famous first and all the rich and all the, look at these people who were able to emulate or assimilate. And all of those are substantive, critical pieces of information. At the same time, we need to look at the diversity of African American experience that contributed to place creation. And so we're trying to make spaces for that too, in what we're collecting through the Atlas, and be more welcoming of all of the stories of people who had some role in the creation. So, and then the last thing is, the story of Texas is of the old 300 and white settlerism. And though we're all on stolen land, even the African American settlers to some extent, not always, there is a growing sense. I spoke before the Texas State Social Studies Association a few weeks ago, and there's a growing sense of contestation of how we teach history in this state, period. And as always, social studies teachers and the supervisors who write the curriculum and the textbook folks, this is the ground where this is, contested. And they really invited more and more opportunities. They wanted to know, how do we take Texas Freedom Colonies project and make it more a part of social studies curricula, Texas history curriculum. So it's really transforming the idea that it's all about these grand white people who decided to come here, who got an extra 80 acres for every enslaved person they brought with them, by the way. And let's just valorize them. And then, oh, by the way, we'll get toward the end and talk about some famous Black firsts that happened in cities. So there's a giant gap. And so when we talk about the whole story of Texas, and if we leave out Texas Freedom Colonies, it's a giant footprint. It's a lot of contributions gone. It's exclusionary. And it also gives African Americans a false idea of what the state is as well, and how much of it they own historically, and that they have a right to. So I hope that answered some of your questions.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, well, I think since this is Dr. Roberts' second talk of the day, I think we should let her go. And really want to thank you. It was a really terrific talk and a really terrific discussion. Hopefully lots of people will be interested in your work and at least check out the website of the Freedom Colonies Project. It's really an amazing, amazing initiative. So thanks so much for coming and sharing with us today.
Thank you so much. It's so good to see everybody. I really appreciate being able to see you again.
Yeah.
Have a good one.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.